The year was 1813, and in the rolling hills of Kentucky, a whisper traveled faster than the wind that cut across the tall grass. It carried through taverns lit by flickering oil lamps, through the smoke of pipe tobacco, and into the uneasy hearts of neighbors who gathered after long days of work. The story, they said, belonged not to generals nor to statesmen, nor even to the brave settlers who carved homes from wilderness. It belonged instead to two sisters, Martha and Mabel Whitlock, twins so beautiful, so cunning, and so merciless that the truth of their deeds was kept out of history books. But here tonight their tale would be told. Before I begin, if you find yourself drawn into stories that history dared to bury, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the shadows behind the past. The Whitlock family lived on the edge of the frontier, in a modest wooden house where the timber creaked during storms and the windows rattled with every passing gust. Samuel Whitlock, their father, was a farmer whose hands were hardened from the plow and the axe. Abigail, his wife, stitched clothes by candlelight and hummed hymns to steady her weary heart. Together, they raised 6 children, though only Martha and Mabel would be remembered beyond the boundaries of their land. The twins were 19, standing on the threshold of adulthood in a society that demanded obedience and virtue from young women. Yet from the moment they could walk, they had shown a different nature. When one cried, the other smiled. When one lied, the other nodded to confirm it. Their bond was unbreakable, yet it was not tenderness that united them. It was a hunger. Neighbors often spoke of their striking resemblance, dark hair falling in curls that refused to be tamed, eyes of sharp grey that seemed to pierce through pretense, lips that curled easily into smiles but never quite softened. At gatherings, men competed for their attention, while women whispered warnings. Some said Martha was the colder of the two, the thinker, the one who watched from the corner until she knew every weakness in a room. Mabel, in contrast, acted with fire. She laughed too loudly, provoked too freely, and never hesitated to strike with words sharper than knives. Kentucky in those years was not a land of ease. War with Britain raged beyond its borders, but for farmers and tradesmen, survival meant harvests, bargains, and the fragile trust of neighbors. Reputation was wealth, and a woman's virtue could seal or ruin an entire family's standing. The Whitlocks, though respected for years, began to feel cracks forming as the twins grew bolder. One evening inside the Whitlock home, Abigail whispered her worry. "Samuel," she said, her voice low as she set bread upon the table, "those girls do not think as others do. Their eyes carry no fear of God, no thought for consequence." Samuel frowned, his beard shadowing a face aged by toil. "They are young," he muttered. "They will find husbands soon enough. A man's guidance will steady them." Yet even he, in the quiet of night, admitted to himself that there was something unsettling about the way his daughters carried themselves. When Martha spoke, he felt as though she weighed his worth, calculating. When Mabel laughed, there was no warmth in it, only amusement at some hidden cruelty. Still, in public, the twins charmed. At church, they sang louder than all others, their voices weaving like silk. At the market, they smiled sweetly at merchants, convincing them to offer better prices. Few dared to oppose them directly, for to do so was to invite whispers against one's own household. The whispers, however, never ceased. Stories of tricks, of small cruelties, of friendships torn apart, followed them like shadows. Yet none could prove anything, and so the twins moved unchecked, their names spoken in hushed tones even as their faces drew admiring gazes. But every shadow lengthens, and in 1813, as the summer air grew heavy with storms, the darkness surrounding Martha and Mabel began to take form. Their story was only beginning, and those who crossed their path would soon learn that beauty and charm could hide something far more dangerous than steel. The Whitlock farm sat on land carved from the wilderness, a place where the forest pressed close, and the soil, though rich, demanded backbreaking labor. Samuel Whitlock rose before dawn, his boots heavy with mud, his shoulders bent from years of lifting plows and chopping wood. His farm produced corn, tobacco, and a few head of cattle, yet the yield never seemed enough. Drought one year, pests the next, debts always waiting. This was the life of a Kentucky farmer in 1813. Inside the farmhouse, Abigail worked without rest. She churned butter in the mornings, mended clothes at midday, and prepared meals over a smoky hearth each night. She carried herself with patience, humming old hymns as though music could steady the burdens laid upon her. Still, her eyes often strayed to her daughters with unease. Martha and Mabel were no longer children, and the more they grew into womanhood, the more they stood apart from the rhythm of farm life. While other young women learned the quiet virtues of homemaking, quilting, tending gardens, or helping neighbors in times of need, the twins resisted. Martha avoided the spinning wheel, declaring it a waste of her mind. Mabel tossed aside the baskets of laundry, preferring instead to wander the fields. Abigail scolded them, yet her words slid off like rain on stone. One afternoon, Abigail confronted them while kneading bread at the long wooden table. "Your father works himself into the ground," she said, her hands dusted in flour, "and I too carry more than my share. You should help with the house as other daughters do." Mabel smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Other daughters are dull. They bury themselves in stitching and gossip. We were not made for such smallness," Martha added quietly, her voice measured and cold. "A woman's worth should not be tied to thread and cloth. There are other ways to rise in this world." Abigail's hands stilled. She looked at them with a mix of fear and sorrow. "Rise? You speak as though the world owes you something. It does not. Here, we survive by humility, by toil, by God's grace." Neither sister answered. They shared a glance, an unspoken pact passing between them, and then slipped outside, leaving their mother with her bread and her dread. Life in the Kentucky frontier revolved around community, as much as it did around family. Neighbors gathered at one another's homes to share food, labor, and news. They bartered for tools and traded livestock, their reputations as valuable as coin. For Samuel, keeping his family's honor intact was a shield against ruin. Yet the twins treated reputation as a game. At the weekly market by the river, where traders displayed barrels of flour, cloth from distant towns, and tools forged in Lexington, Martha and Mabel walked with practiced grace. They charmed merchants into lowering prices, their grey eyes flashing as they tilted their heads just so. More than once, they secured goods without paying in full, convincing men that a promise was as good as coin. Samuel never learned the full extent of these dealings, but the merchants remembered. One merchant, a stout man named Josiah Pike, muttered to another after the twins departed, "Those girls will bleed this town dry with their smiles. Mark me, friend, it won't end well." The other, shifting his hat nervously, replied, "Aye, but who dares cross them?" Their father's name still holds some weight, and folks fear their tongues more than their tricks. Such warnings lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. At church gatherings, mothers whispered to their daughters to keep distance, while young men found themselves drawn closer despite caution. The tension around the Whitlock household grew thicker with each passing season, as though the land itself recognized the storm brewing inside those walls. And yet, Samuel remained blind. To him, the farm's failures came from weather and debt, not from the quiet unraveling of his daughter's place within the community. Abigail, however, knew better. Each night she lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, wondering what kind of fate Martha and Mabel would carve, not with needle and thread, but with ambition sharp enough to wound. The farm endured, but beneath the chores and the fields, something restless stirred in the hearts of the twins. They wanted more than rows of corn and modest Sunday gatherings. They wanted control. And soon they would discover how much power a whisper, a lie, or a well-placed smile could hold. Though the Whitlock farm carried the marks of struggle, Martha and Mabel seemed untouched by hardship. Their bond, forged since the cradle, set them apart not only from their siblings, but from the entire community. Where one moved, the other followed. Where one spoke, the other's silence completed the thought. To outsiders, this closeness was curious, even enviable, but those who looked longer sensed something unsettling, an invisible thread binding them too tightly, woven not with love alone, but with ambition and secrecy. In the quiet hours of dawn, When the rest of the family still slept, the twins often slipped into the meadow behind the house. They sat side by side in the tall grass, their voices low, speaking in a rhythm no one else could follow. They had created signals of their own since childhood, a tilt of the head meaning yes, a blink meaning no, a certain whistle carrying whole sentences. To them, words were unnecessary. Their bond lived in shared glances and hidden laughter. "Did you see Josiah Pike's face when he realized we'd taken his flower for half the price?" Mabel chuckled one morning, plucking a wildflower and twirling it between her fingers. Martha's lips curved slightly, but her eyes remained serious. "He'll complain, but only in whispers. He knows if he angers us, we'll ruin him in the market. Men fear ridicule more than loss." Mabel tossed the flower aside. "It's almost too easy. They believe what they want to believe, and we give them just enough charm to blind them." That was the heart of their power. Where other young women curtsied and bent their heads, Martha and Mabel raised their chins, unafraid of the gaze of men. They knew their beauty was currency, but unlike others, they spent it not for protection or comfort, but for influence. Yet their bond was not only in schemes, it was in the way they protected each other. When Mabel's temper flared and sharp words cut too deep, Martha stepped in with cool explanations that soothed the offended. When Martha's calm demeanor threatened to make her seem aloof, Mabel filled the silence with reckless laughter that drew attention back. They balanced one another, a perfect symmetry of fire and ice. One evening, as twilight painted the fields in shades of blue, the sisters sat on the porch. Abigail was inside, humming as she prepared supper, while Samuel mended a tool by lantern light. Martha leaned toward her twin. "Do you ever wonder why others are so eager to follow rules that chain them?" Mabel tilted her head. "They fear being cast out. To them, belonging is worth more than freedom." "And to us?" Martha asked, her voice low. Mabel's eyes gleamed in the half-light. "Belonging is nothing. Power is everything." The words settled between them like a vow. At church the following Sunday, their bond was on full display. As the congregation sang hymns, the twins' voices intertwined in perfect harmony. Parishioners looked on with admiration, but Martha's mind was elsewhere, watching how her sister's hand rested casually on the arm of a young man seated nearby. She recognized the effect immediately: his stiff posture, his sideways glances, his flushed cheeks. Mabel was playing a game, and Martha approved. After the service, as the congregation spilled into the yard, Martha whispered to her sister, "You have him snared already." Mabel laughed softly. "He is hardly a challenge. Give me a week and he'll swear his life belongs to me." Together they strolled past groups of whispering women, their heads held high. Their bond gave them confidence, and their confidence fed the rumors. The community could not decide if they were blessed or cursed, and that uncertainty gave the twins a dangerous freedom. Inside their shared world, the sisters grew bolder, testing limits, studying weaknesses, and discovering that when two minds worked as one, there were few barriers they could not bend. The people of Kentucky saw them as charming, perhaps troublesome, but still just girls. None yet understood the storm forming in their unity, nor the ruin it would bring. That truth lived only between Martha and Mabel, carried in secret glances and whispered vows beneath the endless Kentucky sky. Summer in Kentucky brought not only heat, but restlessness. The long days filled with toil gave way to evenings where young men lingered outside church gatherings or leaned against fence posts after market days, their eyes searching for companionship. Among them, two suitors stood out, Thomas Avery and Daniel Crow. Thomas was tall, broad-shouldered, and earnest, a farmer's son whose hands bore the calluses of honest work. He spoke plainly, with little flair, but his sincerity was known throughout the county. Daniel, in contrast, was quick-witted and charming, a blacksmith's apprentice who carried the confidence of someone who knew his strength could bend iron and perhaps the will of others. Both men, in their own ways, fell under the spell of the Whitlock twins. Mabel delighted in Daniel's daring. He matched her sharp remarks with laughter, never backing down, and she found his fire entertaining. Martha, however, observed Thomas's quiet nature with curiosity. His honesty fascinated her, for she wondered how easily it could be twisted. One evening after Sunday service, Daniel approached Mabel as she lingered under an oak tree. The cicadas sang loudly in the humid air. "You make every sermon easier to endure," he said with a grin, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "And you," Mabel replied, her voice playful, "make every woman roll her eyes." He laughed, undeterred, and she tilted her head in approval. She liked men who didn't flinch. Not far away, Thomas gathered courage to approach Martha. He held his hat in his hands, his voice steady but soft. "Miss Whitlock, I was wondering if you might walk with me one evening, just along the riverbank." "Nothing improper." Martha's lips curved faintly. "Perhaps, but you must be patient, Thomas. I don't give my time so freely." The men left that day, each believing he had made progress, not realizing they had been set upon a collision course. At home, the sisters shared their triumph. "Daniel would fight a bear for me," Mabel boasted, pacing the room. "And Thomas," Martha answered, her voice calm, "is so honest he cannot hide his feelings. That makes him predictable." Mabel laughed, clapping her hands. "Then let us see how far they'll go. Shall we make a game of it?" Martha's eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "Yes, let us measure the weight of pride against desire." Over the following weeks, the sisters played their roles with precision. Mabel offered Daniel sly encouragements, speaking words that could be taken as promises, though she never gave one outright. Martha, meanwhile, rewarded Thomas with fleeting smiles and soft words of approval, just enough to deepen his hope. But whispers travel quickly in small towns. By August, the rivalry between the two men was no secret. In taverns, neighbors speculated which twin would choose whom, and wagers were made quietly over mugs of ale. Daniel mocked Thomas's simplicity, while Thomas condemned Daniel's arrogance. Neither realized that the twins themselves fed this fire, each reporting to the other the words spoken in confidence. The inevitable came on a stifling evening near the riverbank. Daniel confronted Thomas, accusing him of standing in his path. Thomas, though slow to anger, could not bear the insult. Voices rose, fists clenched, and soon knives flashed in the fading light. The fight was brutal but swift, leaving Thomas wounded and Daniel marked by shame when neighbors pulled them apart. The community was aghast. Two respectable young men had nearly killed one another over the attentions of the Whitlock twins. Mothers tightened their grip on their daughters, and fathers muttered warnings. Yet the sisters stood apart, their faces composed, their grey eyes untroubled. That night, as the house lay in uneasy silence, Mabel whispered to her twin, "Did you see them, Martha?" "They would have died for us." Martha's reply was cool and deliberate. "Yes, and this is only the beginning." By autumn, the Whitlock farm bore the weight of more than weary soil. The fight between Thomas and Daniel had not only scandalized the community, but also marked the Whitlock name with suspicion. Whispers clung to Samuel like burrs on his coat, and though he carried himself with the same steady determination, his steps grew heavier with each passing day. The crops that year were meager. The corn was stunted, the tobacco leaves thin and brittle. Samuel blamed the weather at first, muttering as he walked the rows. "The sun burns too hard, the rains come too late." It's nature, not neglect. But when merchants refused him fair prices at market, citing doubts about his daughter's conduct, he realized the truth was far crueler. His family's reputation was slipping through his hands like water. Abigail noticed it too. At the spinning wheel one evening, she spoke in a hushed tone. "Samuel, we cannot ignore what people are saying. They look at Martha and Mabel with mistrust, and now they turn from us as well." Samuel rubbed his brow, his face drawn. "Gossip fades. Work will prove our worth." But gossip did not fade. It spread, fueled by every smirk the twins gave, every glance exchanged behind clasped hands. In taverns, men grumbled that the Whitlock girls had caused blood to spill. At church, women whispered prayers as the sisters passed, as though their very presence invited judgment. The burden pressed hardest on Abigail. She confronted her daughters one cold morning as frost rimmed the window panes. "Do you not see what you've done? Your games bring shame to this house. Your father cannot sell his harvest because of your cruelty." Mabel, warming her hands by the fire, shrugged. "If merchants will not trade, it is because they are weak. Their fears are their own, not ours." Martha, sitting nearby with a book in her lap, added with calm precision, "It is not our fault that others cannot control their passions. We only reveal what is already inside them." Abigail's voice trembled. "You speak as if ruin is a prize. Do you not care for your family?" Mabel's eyes flickered with annoyance. "Family is a weight. Why should we carry the failures of men who cannot hold their own against whispers?" The words struck Abigail like a blow. She turned away, tears threatening but unspilled, knowing resistance only hardened their defiance. Meanwhile, Samuel struggled with debts. A loan he had taken to purchase new tools and seed pressed upon him, and the lender, once cordial, now demanded payment with a sharp edge in his tone. "Your name no longer holds what it once did, Whitlock," the man said. "I'll not be made a fool by your delays." Samuel returned home, shoulders slumped, his voice hoarse when he told Abigail, "If next year's harvest fails, we may lose the farm." The farm itself seemed to mirror the family's state. Fences sagged where Samuel lacked time to mend them. The barn roof leaked during storms. The cattle grew thin from poor pasture. And still the twins carried themselves with the same unshaken pride, as though the decline around them was of no consequence. One evening, as the family gathered at the table, Samuel finally let his frustrations spill. "You girls think yourselves clever," he said, his hand striking the wood with force, "but cleverness will not feed a family. You've played your games and now we all pay the price." Martha met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "If the community punishes us, it is because they envy us. They fear what they cannot control." Mabel leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Perhaps if you fought harder, Father, their envy would not wound you so deeply." The silence that followed was suffocating. Abigail closed her eyes, whispering a prayer beneath her breath, while Samuel's jaw tightened. He said no more, but the look he gave his daughters was one of sorrow mixed with something darker. Fear. The Whitlock family, once steady as the land itself, now teetered on the edge of collapse, and in the hearts of Martha and Mabel there stirred no guilt, only the thrill of watching foundations crack. The church bell tolled each Sunday morning, its sound rolling across the fields and echoing through the valleys. For most in the community, that bell was not only a call to worship, but also a reminder of belonging. Faith bound families together, secured reputations, and marked who could be trusted. To stand outside its order was to be cast into suspicion. And by 1813, the Whitlock family had begun to feel that suspicion like a chill in the bones. Reverend Elijah Turner was not a man easily swayed by gossip, but even he could not ignore the growing disquiet surrounding Martha and Mabel. From the pulpit, his voice carried warnings about vanity, temptation, and the dangers of mocking God's laws. Though he never named the sisters outright, every ear in the congregation knew who the words pointed toward. That morning, as the Whitlocks sat in their pew, Abigail bowed her head in shame. Samuel kept his jaw set, determined not to let whispers break him. But Martha and Mabel exchanged a glance, a flicker of amusement dancing in their eyes. After the sermon, Reverend Turner approached Samuel outside the church. His tone was firm, though he tried to cloak it with kindness. "Brother Whitlock, your family has long been pillars of this community. But your daughters, they test the patience of God and man alike. You must guide them, restrain them before their path leads to ruin." Samuel's face tightened. "They are young. Youth makes mistakes. They will grow wiser." The Reverend laid a hand on his arm. "Wisdom comes only when pride is broken. Do not wait until it is too late." Meanwhile, Mabel entertained herself by toying with the attentions of young men lingering by the church steps. She laughed too loudly, her hand brushing against an arm here, a shoulder there. Mothers pulled their sons away with scolding looks, but the damage was done. Mabel had already planted sparks of desire and resentment. Inside, Martha engaged in quieter subversion. She asked the Reverend's wife questions that seemed innocent, but were designed to mock. "If Eve was punished for seeking knowledge," she said with feigned curiosity, "does that mean ignorance is a woman's true virtue?" The older woman flushed, murmuring a correction, but Martha's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. She enjoyed pressing against boundaries others dared not cross. The result was swift. Neighbors began to distance themselves from the Whitlocks. Invitations to shared meals grew rare. Women avoided Abigail in the market, speaking only in curt replies. The family's pew, once surrounded by friends, stood increasingly isolated. At home, Abigail pleaded with her daughters. One evening, her voice cracked with desperation as she stood before the hearth. "Do you not see what you are doing? The church is the heart of this town. Without its acceptance, we are nothing." Mabel tossed her head back, laughter bubbling forth. "If their faith is so fragile that we can undo it with a glance or a question, perhaps it is not worth keeping." Martha's tone was softer but no less defiant. "Mother, religion is a tool. Some wield it for comfort, others for control. We simply refuse to let it chain us." Abigail's hands trembled as she gripped her apron. "You bring shame upon your father, shame upon this house. The Reverend warns us, the neighbors turn from us. What will be left?" Mabel's smile faded into something sharper. "What will be left is what we take for ourselves." The firelight cast their faces in stark relief, Abigail's weary sorrow against the twins' cold confidence. Outside, the wind pressed against the shutters, as though the world itself bore witness to the divide tearing through the Whitlock family. By the time winter approached, the family's reputation in the church was broken beyond repair. Faith, once a shelter, had become a weapon used against them. And for Martha and Mabel, it only confirmed what they already believed. The community could be bent or broken, but they themselves would not bow. The chill of early spring carried with it the promise of change. Wagons rattled along the dirt road that wound through the Kentucky hills, their wheels sinking into soft earth left by melted snow. On one such wagon arrived Jonathan Hale, a young man from Virginia, who carried with him books bound in worn leather, a mind sharpened by study and an air of quiet conviction. He had come to take the post of schoolteacher for the settlement's children, a role both respected and scrutinized in equal measure. Jonathan was not like the farmers or blacksmiths who filled the town. His speech carried the cadence of education, his clothes, though modest, were better tailored, and his eyes held the calm observation of someone who listened before he spoke. Many welcomed him with curiosity. Others wondered if a man who had spent more time with ink than soil could truly understand the life of the frontier. The Whitlocks noticed him almost immediately. News of his arrival spread quickly through the market, and by the time he attended his first church service, Martha and Mabel were already studying him from their pew. Mabel leaned close to her sister, her voice low but amused. "Look at him, serious as a preacher, though he's younger than most men here. I wonder if his books make him bold or blind." Martha observed in silence for a moment, her sharp grey eyes fixed on the newcomer. "Neither. He is watchful. That makes him dangerous." After the service, Jonathan was introduced to several families. His handshake was firm, his words polite. When he greeted Samuel Whitlock, Samuel welcomed him warmly, grateful perhaps for new company. Abigail, ever hospitable, offered to send bread to his lodging. But when Jonathan's gaze fell upon the twins, the encounter shifted. "Martha, Mabel," Samuel said with a trace of pride. "My daughters." The sisters curtsied, their movements graceful, their smiles perfectly measured. Mabel spoke first, her tone playful. "We've heard much of you already, Mr. Hale. They say you bring not just arithmetic, but the stories of faraway places." Jonathan nodded politely. "I hope to give the children more than numbers and letters. Knowledge is a lantern. It lights paths otherwise left in darkness." Martha tilted her head, her voice smooth. "And what of those who prefer the dark? Not every truth is welcome in every place." Jonathan's gaze lingered on her a moment longer, reading something in her words that others might have missed. "Even so," he replied, "light does not ask permission to shine." The exchange left Abigail uneasy, though she could not say why. Martha and Mabel, however, exchanged a glance of recognition. This man was different. He would not fall as easily into their snares as others had. Within days, Jonathan began teaching in a small cabin near the river. Children gathered eagerly, some barefoot, others clutching slates and chalk. Parents admired his discipline and fairness, though a few muttered that too much learning could lead youth astray. Still, he quickly became a respected figure, his presence adding weight to a community shaken by doubts. For the twins, Jonathan was both a curiosity and a challenge. Mabel admired his composure, amused by how he ignored her provocations. Martha respected his sharp mind, though it stirred in her a desire not to learn, but to test, to see if his principles could be bent, as others had been. One evening, as the family sat at supper, Abigail spoke of the new teacher. "Mr. Hale brings dignity to this town," she said with quiet approval. "Perhaps he is what we have needed." Mabel laughed lightly. "Dignity is a fragile thing. We shall see how long it lasts." Samuel frowned. "Do not trouble him. He is a good man, and we would do well to show him respect." But Martha only smiled faintly, her thoughts hidden. Respect was never given freely in her world. It was tested, measured, and, if possible, broken. The arrival of Jonathan Hale had shifted something in the air. For the first time, the twins faced a man who saw more than their beauty and charm, and in that recognition lay the seed of conflict yet to come. Jonathan Hale's classroom soon became more than a place of learning. It was a small beacon in a community torn by suspicion. The children, who once spent their days between farm chores and simple games, now carried home stories of distant lands, of Roman generals and Greek philosophers, of rivers wider than the Ohio and mountains higher than the Appalachians. Parents listened with pride, though some muttered that too much knowledge filled young heads with dangerous ideas. Among those who lingered near the schoolhouse were Martha and Mabel. At first, they came under the guise of helping, carrying baskets of bread or sitting in the back as though curious about their younger siblings' lessons. But Jonathan, perceptive as ever, quickly understood their intentions. They were not there to learn, they were there to measure him. One afternoon, Martha lingered after the children had left, her hands folded neatly before her. "You speak of history as though men of old were wiser than those who live now," she said. "Do you believe knowledge from across the ocean has more weight than what we see with our own eyes?" Jonathan closed a book with deliberate care. "I believe knowledge, wherever found, frees us from repeating folly. Men rise and fall, but the lessons of their lives remain." Martha's gaze sharpened. "And if one prefers not to be bound by lessons of the past, if one wishes to write their own rules?" He studied her for a long moment before answering. "Then they must accept that their choices carry consequences, and that history will judge them even if men do not." The words struck deeper than he knew. Martha smiled faintly, concealing her unease, but in her mind a challenge had been set. Meanwhile, Mabel sought subtler avenues. She arrived with compliments, leaning close as she asked questions about poetry or foreign lands. "Tell me of London," she urged one evening, her grey eyes wide with feigned wonder. "Do the streets truly shine with lamps at night?" "Do women walk freely without fear?" Jonathan answered patiently, but he never allowed her provocations to unsettle him. "London has its splendour, but it also has its filth. Freedom there as here depends not only on circumstance, but on the choices one makes." Mabel pouted playfully. "Always you speak of choices, of consequences. You sound more like a preacher than a teacher." "And you," Jonathan replied evenly, "sound more like a performer than a student." For a moment Mabel's mask slipped. A flicker of irritation crossed her face, quickly hidden by laughter. Yet the sting remained. No man had ever looked at her and seen through the charm so easily. It made her restless, eager to prove she could bend even him. The sisters debated their progress at night, whispering by candlelight. "He resists me," Mabel admitted, tapping her finger against the table. "Every jest falls flat. He does not blush, does not stumble. He looks at me as if I were a child with tricks too old to amuse." Martha considered this with measured calm. "That makes him useful. A man who cannot be swayed by flattery must be tested another way. Knowledge is his pride. We will use it against him." The next day, Martha began twisting Jonathan's lessons. When he spoke of honor in ancient Rome, she asked whether honor ever fed the hungry. When he recounted tales of justice in Greece, she questioned whether justice was anything more than the will of the strong. The children listened wide-eyed, unsure whether to admire her boldness or fear the sharpness of her tongue. Jonathan did not flinch. "Questions sharpen the mind," he told the class, "but truth is not undone by challenge, it is only made clearer." Still, he noted the glances between the sisters, the way their eyes gleamed at the discomfort they spread. Beneath their beauty, Jonathan sensed a hunger not for knowledge but for control. By the time spring warmed into summer, it was clear. Martha and Mabel had turned their attention fully upon him. Yet while they sought to bend his principles, he had resolved to hold them to account. In their silent war of words, the classroom became a battlefield, and neither side would yield easily. By midsummer, the air in Kentucky grew thick with more than heat. It carried the slow but certain distancing of a community from the Whitlock family. What had once been subtle whispers now became open avoidance. Neighbors who had shared tools and meals no longer crossed the Whitlock threshold. At the market, conversations fell silent when Martha and Mabel approached, and women who once exchanged polite smiles with Abigail turned their backs as if shielding themselves from contagion. The cause was no mystery. Tales of the duel between Thomas and Daniel lingered like a wound that refused to heal, and Jonathan Hale's quiet disapproval had only deepened suspicion. Parents warned their sons to stay away from the twins, muttering that nothing good could come from courting such women. Even the church pew that once stood full now gaped empty, a hollow space between families who no longer wished to sit near them. Abigail bore the brunt of the shame. At the well one morning, when she offered a greeting to her neighbor Ruth Carver, the woman only muttered, "Best mind your daughters," before walking away without another word. Abigail's hands trembled as she carried the bucket home, her face pale. That evening she confided in Samuel. "They treat me as though I am cursed," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "As though their sins are written upon my forehead." Samuel placed a rough hand on her shoulder. "Let them talk. We'll endure. We always have." But even he could not ignore the shifting tide. Merchants tightened their terms, charging him more than others. Men he had worked beside in the fields no longer lingered for conversation. The farm, once sustained by a network of trust, now stood nearly alone. For Martha and Mabel, however, the isolation became a stage. Where others saw disgrace, they saw opportunity. One evening Mabel reclined by the fire, her voice laced with amusement. "Do you see how they fear us, Martha? A single glance from us, and they scatter like frightened hens." Martha, ever more composed, replied, "Fear is a tool. It keeps people cautious, obedient. But we must not squander it on small games. Every rumor we spread, every letter we forge, must serve a purpose." And so their mischief grew more deliberate. They penned anonymous notes, planting false stories that neighbors had cheated in trade or spoken ill of one another. They whispered into eager ears that certain men had betrayed confidences, certain women had coveted what was not theirs. Soon, the community found itself tangled in suspicion, each family doubting the other. Jonathan, watching from the margins, began to notice the pattern. He heard the same turns of phrase repeated in different mouths, the same sparks of rumor that always seemed to trace back to the Whitlocks. When he spoke of it, some dismissed him. "You see too much, teacher," one farmer told him. "Best keep to your books." But Jonathan's conviction only hardened. Meanwhile, Abigail tried once more to reach her daughters. She caught them whispering late one night, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows on the wall. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Whatever you are doing, stop. We are already cast out enough. Must you deepen our exile?" Mabel's laughter cut through the plea like a blade. "Exile? No, mother. We are not cast out, they are. We live freely while they cower in their small fears." Martha closed the book she had been reading and spoke calmly. "Do not mistake our choices for mistakes. The world bends to those who dare shape it." Abigail turned away, clutching her apron to still her shaking hands. She knew then that her daughters were no longer merely mischievous girls. They were carving a path that would leave no place for remorse. As the weeks passed, the Whitlock farm became an island, shunned by those around it. But the twins thrived on the isolation, their bond unbroken, their schemes more intricate. The community thought exile would weaken them, but in truth it only hardened their resolve. By the turn of summer into autumn, the Whitlock farm could no longer conceal its decline. Fences sagged, tools dulled, and the once strong oxen grew gaunt from overwork. Samuel rose before dawn each day, yet his labor yielded little. He carried his weariness like a weight across his shoulders, though pride kept him from admitting defeat. But the debts hung over him like storm clouds, and his patience with his daughters grew thin. One evening, he returned from the river town of Frankfurt, his face flushed with frustration. The family gathered at the table, and Abigail immediately saw the tremor in his hands as he set down his hat. "They would not honor the price," Samuel muttered, his voice hoarse. "Merchants I've dealt with for years now treat me like a beggar. They say our name is tainted, that my daughters bring disgrace, and when I pressed for fairness, they laughed at me in front of others." His fist struck the table, rattling the cups. Abigail flinched while Martha and Mabel exchanged a silent look, not of shame but of quiet amusement. "You've let your games poison our livelihood," Samuel thundered, his eyes burning with fury. "I've broken my back for this family, and still it crumbles. And you," he pointed at the twins, "you've turned the town against us with your scheming." Mabel's lips curled into a mocking smile. Perhaps the town was weak to begin with. "If they can be swayed so easily, why blame us for their foolishness?" Martha's voice followed, calm and precise. "You speak of merchants as if they ever cared for you, Father. They saw an opportunity to strike, and they took it. We merely revealed their true nature." Abigail's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. "Please," she whispered, her eyes darting between them. "Enough of blame. We must think of how to survive the winter." But Samuel could not let go. His pride, bruised by public humiliation, demanded a reckoning. "If you were sons, I would beat this arrogance out of you. But as daughters—" His voice faltered, torn between anger and helplessness. The twins leaned back, their composure unshaken. Mabel's laughter rang sharp in the tense air. "Then it is fortunate we are not sons. You cannot break us, Father. Not with your hands, not with your words." The silence that followed was thick as the smoke curling from the hearth. Abigail covered her face, whispering prayers, but Samuel's chest heaved with the weight of his rage. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling beams, his body stiff, his mind filled with despair. Days later, he made one last attempt to secure a deal. He carried the last of his tobacco crop downriver, hoping to strike a bargain that would ease their debts. But when the contract was drawn, Martha and Mabel, insisting on accompanying him, whispered among themselves. They saw the agreement as unworthy of their family's standing. "Father, this deal cheats you," Martha murmured as the merchant prepared the papers. "The land itself is worth more than these terms. Only a fool would sign." Mabel added with a smirk, "And surely you are not a fool, are you?" Samuel's hand shook as he held the quill. The merchant, impatient, urged him to sign, yet the twins' voices wove doubt into his mind. Finally, in a moment of weakness, he refused the contract. The merchant stormed away, cursing the Whitlock name, and the last chance for relief slipped through his grasp. When they returned home, Abigail knew something had broken. Samuel sat in silence, his face grey, his body slumped in the chair as though all strength had drained from him. That night he collapsed, the stress of failure pressing harder than any sickness. The Whitlock household, already shunned, now stood on the edge of ruin, not only in wealth, but in spirit. And for Martha and Mabel, the collapse of their father was not a tragedy to weep over, but another crack in the foundation they had long sought to control. The collapse of Samuel's strength weighed upon the Whitlock household like a funeral shroud. He no longer rose before dawn to tend the fields. Instead, he sat in silence, his body weakened, his spirit hollowed out by failure. The man who had once carried ploughs across his shoulders now struggled to lift even a bucket of water. His silence was worse than anger. It was the sound of defeat. Abigail carried the burden in his place. She worked from morning to night, gathering what little remained from the fields, patching leaks in the roof, tending to her husband with weary hands. Her back ached, her fingers cracked, yet she pressed on. But what broke her most was not labor. It was the sight of her daughters watching, unbothered, as though the decline of their father were nothing more than another season passing. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Abigail stood before Martha and Mabel, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes blazing with a rare intensity. "You must stop this path," she pleaded. "Look at your father. Look at this house. You chase shadows of power while your family collapses. For once, I beg you, choose a life of steadiness. Marry good men. Build homes. Leave behind this pride before it destroys us all." Mabel reclined in her chair, her lips twisting into a smirk. "Marry? To what end? To spend our days bending over washtubs like you? To break our backs on fields like father? That is no life. It is a sentence." Martha's voice was cooler, deliberate. "Mother, you mistake ambition for pride. We see the truth of this world. Only those willing to seize control escape misery. Why should we settle for scraps when we might own the table?" Abigail's hands trembled as she clutched her apron. "Because power without conscience will devour you. I raised you with prayers and hymns, but I see nothing of God in your hearts. Only hunger." For the first time, Martha's expression softened, though not with remorse. She regarded her mother as one might a frail opponent. Perhaps God favors those who act, not those who wait. Abigail turned away, tears streaming down her face. She sank into the chair beside Samuel, taking his limp hand in hers. His eyes flickered open, dim and clouded, and he whispered, "Abigail, let them be. They will walk their own road." But Abigail could not let go so easily. In the days that followed, she sought counsel from the few neighbors who still offered her kindness. Ruth Carver, though cautious, listened. "Pray harder, Abigail," she said softly. "Sometimes the Lord tests us through our children. Others were harsher." "Your daughters are cursed," muttered one man at the market. "No preacher, no prayer will mend them now." Abigail returned home with the words gnawing at her heart. At night, as wind howled against the shutters, she knelt by her bed and prayed until her knees ached. "Lord, break their pride. Spare them from themselves. Do not let them drag us all into ruin." Yet each morning Martha and Mabel rose untouched, their faces serene, their bond unbroken. They spoke of plans beyond the farm, of land, of influence, of bending others to their will. To them, their father's weakness was a lesson, never to let themselves be so vulnerable, never to bow to pity or circumstance. One evening, Abigail tried once more. As the sun bled red across the horizon, she cornered Mabel outside the house. "You are still my child," she whispered desperately, gripping her daughter's arm. "You can turn back. It is not too late." Mabel pulled free with a sharp laugh. "Too late? Mother, it has only just begun." The words pierced Abigail like a blade. She sank to her knees in the dirt, staring after her daughter as the shadows lengthened. Inside, Martha watched from the window, her expression unreadable. She knew her mother's pleas would not stop them. The road ahead was clear, and neither prayer nor desperation could divert them from it. Jonathan Hale had watched quietly for months as the Whitlock twins sowed unrest. He had seen children repeat Martha's twisted questions in class, their young minds turning cynicism into sport. He had seen Mabel play her dangerous games with young men, stoking rivalries that festered long after the laughter faded. And he had seen Abigail's shoulders sag under the weight of despair, her eyes dulled by shame. One evening after dismissing his students, Jonathan lingered by the schoolhouse door as Martha approached, her step measured, her expression composed. "You speak of virtue as though it were armor," she said calmly, her voice carrying in the fading light. "But armor only weighs a man down. Tell me, mister. Hale, have you never wished to cast it aside and taste the freedom of unguarded life?" Jonathan regarded her steadily. "Virtue is not armor. It is the ground we stand upon. Without it, there is no foundation, only quicksand." Martha's eyes narrowed, though her smile remained. "Quicksand can swallow a man who stands too long in one place. I would rather move even if the path is uncertain." Jonathan shook his head. "Movement without principle is not freedom, Miss Whitlock. It is chaos." She studied him for a moment, her composure unbroken, then turned and left without another word. But in her mind the conversation had not ended. It had only sharpened her resolve to prove him wrong. Mabel, less patient, confronted Jonathan days later at the market. She cornered him near the stalls, her tone laced with mockery. "You speak as though you see through me, Mr. Hale. Tell me, do you enjoy setting yourself as judge of women you cannot understand?" Jonathan stood firm. "I do not judge by beauty or wit, Miss Mabel. I judge by actions. And yours leave a trail of harm you cannot deny." Her laughter rang out, startling the passers-by. "Harm? Men fight because they are fools. Women whisper because they are jealous. Why lay their weakness at my feet?" Jonathan's reply was quiet but steady. "Because you choose to exploit their weakness rather than strengthen their good. That is the difference between vanity and character." Mabel's smile faltered, if only for a moment, before she spun on her heel and walked away. The exchange had unsettled her more than she cared to admit. That night, the sisters debated his words. Mabel paced furiously, her anger sharp. "He dares to scold me in public as though I were a child in need of correction. I will not have it." Martha, seated by the window, was more contemplative. "He is not like the others. Their flattery bends, but his conviction stands. Breaking him will take more than charm." Mabel's eyes flashed. "Then we must break him harder. If he believes us dangerous, let us show him just how dangerous we can be." Meanwhile, Jonathan confided in one of his few trusted acquaintances, an older farmer named Elias Ward. Over a shared drink of cider, Jonathan spoke plainly. "Those girls wield influence like a blade. The town dismisses it as mischief, but I see the harm spreading. If no one opposes them, they will ruin what little unity we have left." Elias frowned, shaking his head. "Careful, teacher. Folks already whisper you've set yourself against them. Some fear your words will stir more division." Jonathan's jaw tightened. Truth must be spoken, even if it divides. Better a wound that heals than a sickness that festers. The resolve in his voice was clear. He would not stand by while Martha and Mabel spread their poison unchecked. For the first time, the twins had found someone unwilling to yield to their games, and in that defiance, a confrontation loomed, one that would test not only their cunning, but also the strength of his convictions. The Whitlock sisters had watched their father's collapse with cold detachment, but to them it was not an end. It was an opportunity. With Samuel too weak to command the household, and Abigail worn down by despair, Martha and Mabel felt the reins of power fully in their hands. The farm might have faltered, but influence, they believed, was not rooted in soil. It was rooted in perception, in signatures, in names written on parchment. And so their eyes turned to a wealthy landowner, Silas Dobbins, a man whose estate lay across the river. Silas was older, his fortune built on years of trade and shrewd dealings, but he was known to be careless with drink and careless with flattery. He enjoyed the company of youth, basking in their attention as though it preserved his own vigor. Mabel was the first to suggest it. "He grows drunk on admiration," she said, her tone sly as she leaned close to her sister. "If we charm him, he'll sign anything we place before him." Martha considered this with her usual precision. "Charm will open the door, but a document, crafted carefully, will close it behind him. If we can secure his land, we will not only rise above this farm, we will rise above this town." They began to weave their plan. Martha studied old contracts Samuel had kept in the cupboard, memorizing the language of agreements. With stolen ink and parchment, she drafted a false deed that, once signed, would transfer a portion of Silas's land to their name. Mabel, meanwhile, set about ensuring Silas's attention never wavered. At a gathering near the river, she approached him, laughter bright and eyes wide with feigned admiration. "Mr. Dobbins, they say no man in these parts knows the river routes as well as you. Tell us of your ventures. Surely no tale is too grand for such company." Silas, flushed with pride and ale, obliged readily. His booming voice carried across the crowd as he recounted tales of profits and risks, of shipments downriver and bargains struck in Lexington. All the while Mabel leaned closer, feeding his vanity with gasps and applause. Later Martha joined them, slipping the forged paper into the conversation, as though it were nothing more than an agreement of friendship. "It is merely a token of trust," she said smoothly, "a sign that our families might remain bound in goodwill." Silas, intoxicated and eager to impress, took the quill without hesitation. His scrawl sprawled across the page, sealing his own undoing. The sisters exchanged a look of triumph, silent and sharp. But triumph does not remain hidden. Jonathan Hale, ever watchful, had grown suspicious of their increasing visits to Silas's estate. He noticed the whispers, the smug satisfaction in their eyes, and the way Silas spoke of his new arrangements without clarity. He pressed quietly, asking questions of those who served in Silas's household, piecing together the truth. One afternoon, Jonathan confronted Martha directly. "I know what you've done," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the storm of tension between them. "That document bears the stain of deceit. You may fool Silas in his drunkenness, but you cannot fool me." Martha's expression did not waver. "You speak as though your word is law. But tell me, Mr. Hale, who will believe you over us? A teacher with no wealth, no family here, against daughters of a household that has lived on this land for years." Jonathan's reply was unwavering. "Truth does not depend on wealth, it depends on evidence. And I will bring it forward no matter what it costs me." For the first time Martha felt a flicker of unease, yet she concealed it behind a thin smile. "Then we shall see, teacher. Perhaps history will remember who stands and who falls." The game had shifted. What had begun as whispers and manipulations had now risen to open conflict, and the sisters knew that Jonathan Hale would not rest until their schemes were laid bare. Word of Silas Dobbins's drunken signature spread quickly, not because he boasted of it, but because he realized too late what he had done. When he sobered and examined the document, he saw land transferred not by bargain but by trickery. His anger erupted, but shame held him back from immediate confrontation. To admit he had been deceived by two young women was to admit his own weakness. Yet silence could not contain the truth forever. Jonathan Hale seized the moment. With steady patience he gathered proof. The testimony of a servant who had seen Martha slip the document forward, the inconsistencies in Silas's own story, and most damning, the handwriting that betrayed forgery. He presented his findings not in secret, but before the very townsfolk who had long whispered about the Whitlocks. At first there was disbelief. The twins had always been clever enough to shroud their actions in ambiguity. But as evidence mounted, the crowd murmured in restless waves. Martha and Mabel stood together, their faces calm masks, but beneath the surface they felt the tide turning against them. One man spoke aloud, his voice carrying. "We let them toy with our sons, our brothers, our trade. We excused it as mischief. But this is theft." Women who once clutched their children tighter as the twins passed now glared openly, their whispers turned to open condemnation. The community, long divided by rumor, had found common cause in outrage. That evening, Samuel sat hunched by the hearth, the weight of disgrace pressing upon him. He had no strength left to defend his daughters, no voice to argue their innocence. Abigail, though worn by years of pleading, now stood silent, her prayers dried up like a well gone empty. The confrontation came swiftly. Jonathan stood before Martha and Mabel, his voice unshaken. "Your charm has shielded you long enough, but deceit, once revealed, cannot be hidden again. The community will not suffer you further." Mabel sneered, her defiance unbroken. "You think yourself righteous, teacher, but righteousness does not feed men, fear does, and we—" Jonathan cut her short. "Fear only lasts until truth is spoken aloud, and today it has been." The crowd's anger grew. No stones were thrown, no torches lit, but the judgment was just as final. Families who once vied for the sisters' smiles now turned their backs. Men who once followed them with eager eyes spat their names like curses. Where beauty had once opened doors, now it closed them. That night, Martha and Mabel sat together in their dim room. The candle between them flickered weakly, its flame struggling in the draught. For the first time, silence lingered heavily between them. "They hate us now," Mabel muttered bitterly, her hands clenched. "Every last one of them, all because of him." Martha's grey eyes were steady, though shadowed. "Not because of him, because we let them see too much. We pushed too far. Even fear must be fed carefully, or it turns into fury." Mabel slammed her fist against the table. "So what now? Shall we bow? Shall we crawl like Mother wished? Martha shook her head slowly. No, we do not bow. But neither can we stay. A land that once bent to us now spits us out. Our power lies not in their forgiveness, but in our leaving. Their bond, unbroken through years of schemes, tightened again in the face of loss. If the town would no longer serve them, they would seek another place, another stage for their ambition. By dawn, the decision was made. The Whitlock twins would abandon the land that had birthed both their rise and their ruin. The people of Kentucky, though finally freed of their influence, would never forget the scars they left behind. And Jonathan Hale, though victorious, carried with him the knowledge that darkness, once cast out, often seeks new ground on which to grow. The morning of their departure arrived without ceremony. Martha and Mabel Whitlock left the farm as silently as they had once entered the world, side by side, their belongings packed into a single wagon drawn by a weary mule. Samuel remained seated in his chair by the hearth, too frail to protest, while Abigail watched from the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Tears filled her eyes, but no words came. She had pleaded, prayed, begged, and fought, yet her daughters walked away untouched, bound only to each other and to the hunger that had defined their lives. The town did not gather to bid them farewell. No one stood in the road to wish them luck. Doors closed as they passed, shutters drawn against their grey eyes and unrepentant faces. To the community, the departure was a release, a final severing of ties with two women who had caused so much discord. Mabel broke the silence first, her tone sharp but laced with bitterness. Look at them, hiding like cowards. They fear us still. Martha kept her gaze forward, her voice even. Fear, hatred, it matters little. What matters is that we remain free. They think they have cast us out, but in truth we have cast them aside. Behind them, the Whitlock farm stood in ruin, its fences broken, its fields untended. Samuel's strength had ebbed beyond return, and Abigail's heart carried more grief than one soul should bear. The daughters left not only a family, but a legacy of division and sorrow. Jonathan Hale, watching from a distance, felt no triumph. Though the community had turned against the twins at last, he knew their departure did not end the danger. Men and women like Martha and Mabel did not vanish. They moved, they adapted, they found new ground. He prayed silently that wherever they went, their hunger would one day meet a wall it could not break. The years would erase their names from official record. History books spoke of wars and treaties, of generals and presidents, but not of two sisters from Kentucky who had manipulated their neighbors and nearly torn apart a town. Their story survived only in whispers told in taverns, passed from one cautious tongue to another, the Whitlock twins, too cruel, too cunning, too evil for history to remember. Yet their absence left behind a question, one that gnawed at the minds of those who had known them. Were Martha and Mabel merely products of hardship and neglect, or had something colder always lived in their hearts? Some argued that the times bred such defiance, an age of survival where the strong seized what they could. Others insisted the twins had chosen their path freely, delighting in harm, rejecting every chance for redemption. Abigail, in her final years, carried only sorrow. When neighbors spoke of her daughters, she would shake her head and murmur, "They were mine, yet they were never mine." Samuel passed in silence, his once strong hands limp and empty. The farm fell into other hands, but the whispers lingered in the valleys long after, and so the tale of Martha and Mabel closes not with repentance, nor with punishment in chains, but with disappearance into obscurity. Perhaps they found another town, another set of hearts to twist. Perhaps they wandered endlessly, bound only to one another and to the shadows they carried. Their fate remains uncertain, their names buried not by time alone, but by deliberate forgetting. But here their story has been spoken. It reminds us that history does not only belong to heroes or leaders, it also belongs to those whose cunning left wounds too deep to forget, even if their names were scrubbed from the page. If this tale of the Whitlock twins has kept you listening, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the hidden stories that history tried to erase. And if you're ready to continue down darker roads of the past, click on the next video waiting for you. Another chapter, another secret, another truth too unsettling for the books.